All right, gang. What's up? Mod Zero Session 1. Let's get this thing popping right now. All right. Well, hello. My name is Eric Weissman. I'm an instructor here at the Turing School of Software and Design. Joining me tonight will be Mason and Margot. They're also instructors on our team who've done a great job working on Mod Zero with us. So you're going to kind of get to know us a little bit this evening, but we're going to spend a lot more time kind of getting to know y'all. Before we do that, let's jump into our learning goals for today. Jacob S., can you unmute and read our first learning goal, please?
Yes, sir. So it's understand how to utilize Slack and Zoom during Mod Zero.
Awesome. Ms. Sean, am I saying that right? I think you might be muted. If you don't mind unmuting and reading our second learning goal, that'd be great. You're all good.
I'm reading the second.
Yeah.
Understand the full stack of web development at a high level.
Awesome. Jacob Q, can you read our third learning goal, please?
Refine searching and filtering skills to Google programming questions.
Cool. Kendall, can you read our fourth learning goal, please?
Brainstorm classes for specific objects.
Sweet. And finally, our fifth learning goal, Gunnar.
Yeah, it's define and identify use cases for basic data types.
Sweet. So each lesson, we're going to kind of ground ourselves in the learning goals, and this is kind of what we're going to come back to as we work through each lesson. So before we really get fully into it, I want everyone to start by practicing actually updating your name in Slack to follow this this kind of setup. So if you'll notice, if you look at my name, I have a status symbol next to my name that kind of just gives me a pulse check on how I'm doing. I have to go get a COVID test tomorrow, so I'm kind of bugging about that. So I'm a little stressed about that, and that's impacting how I'm feeling tonight. But fingers crossed, I think I'll be good. So my status is orange. So what I want you to do is I want you in the participants menu to find your name. This is one way you can do it, and press rename. And I want you to write your name in the following pattern. So you can do, I want you to choose your status. So the easiest way to do that is to open the emoji keyboard. You can open an emoji keyboard on a Mac using any one of using this shortcut command if you are inside a text field. So once you click inside your name, you can hit Control, Command, and Space. Then I just recommend searching for green, yellow, orange, red. That'll pull up which color you're feeling real quick. Do your first name, last initial, and which pronouns you want to use, as well as the program you're in. I'll give you all about 30 seconds to do that. Let's see, Maria's got hers updated. Ashley, Darla, John, cool. Again, if you're having trouble pulling up that menu, make sure that you have clicked inside of where it says enter new name here. That'll allow you to pull up that emoji menu. So again, it's good to just kind of get a sense of how y'all are doing each night. We're going to ask you to kind of do this each time we kick off a session so we can kind of get a sense of how you're doing, how you're feeling. Sweet. So let's get into it. So one thing we're going to kind of practice as we start out today is making sure we have a good sense of our expectations around communicating during class. So I recommend that you have your video on and your microphone muted, unless you're actively speaking, of course, right? And in terms of we're gonna be launching into a lot of new content and stuff that many of you have no idea about, which is great. So there's probably gonna be a lot of questions that come up. I like kind of three ways to ask questions. I think for me personally, the best way is just to literally unmute and ask your question to our group. Totally cool to interrupt. That's totally fine with me. You can also raise like your digital hand. So if you go to like your participants menu, you should have an option in Zoom to like raise hand. And myself or Margot or Mason will be able to kind of catch that and be able to address your question at that point. I've also created a Slack thread for if you have questions that relate to content that might be like a little bit more high level or maybe not directly related to something that we're talking about in that moment. So if you look into our 2011 or Mod Zero 2011B, you'll see that I created a questions thread. So what you can do if you like take a look at that is if you hover over that option, you should have the option to hit that reply in thread, and that'll allow you to ask any questions there. There might be times too where some of y'all like ask some like really great questions that might not exactly be totally on topic with what we're doing, and that's okay. I might just direct you to drop that question in that thread so that we can get visibility for all of us, and it'll allow myself or the other TAs to circle back on that at a later time. Any questions on that? Any questions on asking questions? Alrighty then, let's keep it cracking. So we're gonna just make sure, again, this is kind of going off of that practice you had in that Mod Zero pre-work about being able to ask questions in a thread. So I'm gonna create a new thread for us in our 2011B. What is your favorite all-time snack, drink, or treat? Take a second to reply in a thread to that question. If you don't do it correctly, I may just ask you to make sure you do it in a thread. We're going to be using threads a lot in Mod Zero and throughout Turing. So whenever you have a sec, feel free to drop your answer in there.
Yo, I have a question. All right, so what's the Turing Slack channel?
Yep. So let me make sure. So if you have you joined the Slack channel yet? Like our Slack organization?
I'm part of Slack. I can see like the salaries and like
Cool,
announcements
cool,
and
cool.
shit
All
like
right,
that.
let me add
stuff
you to
like
this
that.
real quick. In the chat, will you shoot me your email?
In the chat of Slack?
Let me see if I can just pull you up this way. Cool. I just added you to our channel, so you should have just been invited to that. Sorry about
Yeah.
that.
No worries, mate.
You're all good. Cool. All right, a lot of pizza fans. A lot of LaCroix. All right. Okay. Sweet. So y'all seem to have a good handle on threading. That's going to be great, and we're going to use that a lot when we're in here in Mod Zero and at Turing. Raise your hand like your actual human hand as people were like responding to that thread, like you heard all those like notification chimes and things going off. Anyone? Cool. Well, if you did, you also got to know like that's really annoying. And I know that for myself, like that will make me very distracted. One thing I want to bring y'all's attention to is that you have the ability to, for a particular thread, you can still like essentially opt out of getting notifications about when people have responded. You'll still have the ability to always actually like go back and see what people have written at any point. But what you can do is you can hover over the three dots like on a specific thread. And then that's going to allow you to then choose this unfollow message option, which will essentially allow you to still kind of see everything that's going on, but without any of the actual like pings and notifications every single time. Again, this is part of just like getting a sense and awareness of like what works for you, trying to eliminate distractions where you can so you can stay focused when you're in here and in class. Cool. All right. So what we're going to do too a lot of times in Mod Zero and through the Turing experience is we're going to use breakout rooms a lot to kind of work in smaller groups or pairs so that we can kind of move in from like large group to small group and really like dive into some concepts. So a couple things about breakout rooms. I think like now that most of us are about like a year into this whole COVID remote situation, I'm sure you've had some exposure to Zoom. If not a big deal at all. We're gonna have a lot of practice with that in Mod Zero. But I think it's really important to make sure that we're all on the same page about some really basic norms for Zoom breakout rooms or when we're working in small groups. I think the first thing to do is be aware and try not to talk over others. Obviously, there's going to be those times where there's like that little like delay or lag or whatnot, and people kind of like step on each other's toes a little bit. That's going to happen, but try and be mindful of how much you're talking versus how much you're listening, and being really good about trying to make sure you're not talking over others. Any questions on that? Cool. Again, kind of like the same vein, like making sure that you're leaving space and time for everyone to share. Often when we go into breakout rooms, we'll prompt you as to like how long we want you to spend in those rooms and like what we want you to talk about. So just kind of keep an eye on like making sure there's time for everyone to speak and share and think. So we're going to do some breakout rooms. I want you to start by introducing yourself with your name, your pronouns, and the program that you are going to be in. Where do you call home? And I want you to talk about what stood out most to you from Aaron's thoughts on professionalism that you were asked to read before a class. Again, I posted that in our Slack, and also that was part of like the Mod Zero pre-work. If you didn't have a chance to look at that, like make sure you take like 2 minutes to take a look at that. It's in our Slack again, or in that Mod Zero pre-work. We'll spend about like 5 minutes or so in these breakout groups. And then we'll kind of bring it back together and do some whole class sharing out. So again, be prepared to share either what you or someone else took away from that kind of thoughts on professionalism piece. I'm gonna leave it to Margot and Mason to kind of work on those breakout rooms for you. Any questions before we head into these breakout rooms about like what I'm asking you to talk about, or what are expectations for you in these breakout rooms? Cool. All righty, you should be getting an invitation to join a breakout room soonish here, and then we'll see you on a little bit. Hey, what's up, gang?
Howdy.
Fun.
Happy
going?
New Year.
Happy New Year.
New Year.
We made it.
Yeah, for real, it's a miracle. So I've been doing this, we've been doing this with the last session where we have them kind of doing these status checks. If you don't mind just jotting down anyone who's orange or red, because those are folks who might want to follow up with if we get like back-to-backs.
So what is, sorry, the orange red thing? Sorry, I'm kind of confused on that.
Yeah. So, alrighty, gang. Cool. So y'all had a chance to talk about, get some introductions, where you call home. But I'm really interested to hear a little bit about some of the takeaways either you or someone in your group had about like the thoughts on professionalism article I had y'all read. Robbie D, do you mind unmuting and just sharing either with us, like either something that you took away from that article, or that kind of those thoughts on professionalism from a Turing grad, or something that your group members talked about?
Okay, so something 2 out of the 5, I think, people in our breakout room brought up that professionalism, an element of it is not kind of like acting like you know all the answers and reaching out for help when you need it. And I thought that was a great takeaway. And I thought that was a really kind of interesting take on it that I hadn't even thought of.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Jermaine, what's something that either you or your group took away from that article?
Sure. I was actually in the same group as Robbie, but same thing. Well, for myself, I guess, would be for advocating for others. So making sure people have the space to speak, and for yourself as well, making sure you're comfortable and speaking up for yourself to basically take the right steps. Sweet.
Maria D, what's something you or your group pulled away from this article?
I just realized I wasn't on mute.
You're all good.
Well, just showing up is a lot, and also just how professionalism means like a lot of different things. Like I wouldn't have put that list together myself if someone was to ask me like what my thoughts on professionalism would have been.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, so like for added context, right, this is written from a grad of ours who graduated like a couple mods ago. And I think it's like important too, like, you know, I was in y'all's shoes too before, like I went through the program in 2010. And like, I know it's probably like nerve wracking, like you're taking on a really big challenge here, but I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves in what we know we have seen be really successful here. And I think Aaron did a really good job of capturing a lot of those skills and mindsets and approaches to really be successful, not only in this program, but to help you catapult yourself into your next career, right? Here's an obscure Jurassic Park meme I found that I think does a good job of capturing this too. Where he says, hey, everybody, he's trying to learn a new skill and is kind of awkward and feels silly because he's still learning. Well, guess what? That's all of you. If y'all knew how to do this already, you wouldn't be here. But again, like the second part I think is more important, where that like nobody cares if you feel a little weird or awkward, like you're supposed to. You're out of your comfort zone. Keep practicing. Getting good at something takes time, and we're going to kind of put in the time and effort to make that happen here at Turing. Okay. So to kind of like continue on this theme, I think like it's important to maybe like bust a few myths you might have or have heard about Turing, or about like what it takes to really do what y'all are about to do, which is like embark on a journey to change your careers. All right, so the first myth is like the lone wolf. This is like the person who's like, you know what, like I'm coming here because like I'm just here to learn the code. Like I'm not really here to like make friends or like do anything like that. Like I'm literally just here to learn how to code, and that's all I'm here to do. I can tell you, having taught almost every module in our program, that this mindset doesn't work well in our program. And more importantly, it doesn't work well in the industry. You are going to be working on teams, not only through our program, but when you're like actually on the job. And we want you to be able to like, there are a lot of coding programs or boot camps that you can do where it's like just coding and that's it. We've found that our students are more successful and have a better rate of getting jobs. And I think it's important that if you came here with that attitude, might be worth it to rethink if this is the right place for you. Another kind of key myth here at Turing is that I think, you know, you're going to be working through a lot of really tough and tricky projects. And I think a lot of times you're going to be working with concepts that are very new to you, a lot of new technical skills. And I think a lot of people like have heard about projects maybe failing or not working. And I think a lot of people think that has to do with technical problems. Having been a project manager on like hundreds of projects throughout Turing, I can tell you like 99.9% of the time, that is not the case. Failing projects typically fail because of failures with members of a group, and really around communicating and working together and problem solving as a team. So again, both of these like kind of myths are trying to illuminate that like it's not all about the technical skills. Another myth, I had this one pretty bad, was like, oh, I did well in other academic settings like high school or maybe college or something like that. This should be easy. Well, school success is not the same as Turing success. And I think you'll start to see that how we ask you to learn and engage with the material is going to be a lot different than some of the school settings that you may have been used to growing up. I think like kind of the big key takeaway with this is that, you know, at Turing, like this isn't a competition. Y'all are all in this together and working with one another to kind of learn and grow and become badass developers. So don't look at each other as like competitors. You should be looking at each other as colleagues. Because quite frankly, like this is the beginning of your network who are going to help you get jobs. I'd say like as y'all are applying for your first jobs, probably not going to be as much pull, but as y'all are applying to your second and third jobs and have an ability to like reach out to people you've worked with, these are going to be the people who are going to help you get those jobs. The other thing I want to bring up too is that right now in Mod 0, we're a mixed cohort, which means that we have front-end developers and back-end developers. You're going to be going through the majority of the program in your specific like front-end or back-end. However, when you get to Mod 4, we actually have you back as a mixed cohort where you're going to be working in like a more full stack environment. We're going to talk about the stack in a little bit. So again, I'd say like put it all out there, get to know each other a little bit. Totally chill to be awkward about this. We'll get through it. And I think that's the first step to really making a strong team with one another. I got two more myths. The next one is being good at coding is the most important skill employers are looking for. To give you some transparency into how we build our curriculum and how we build our projects, we are working hand in hand with hiring managers, engineering leads, you name it, across the industry. And like, without question, what separates our grads from other boot camps and computer science degrees is that y'all are going to graduate this program with the skills, like the technical chops to do well in the job. What separates our students from others is that y'all are going to get way more experience with project management, working together in collaboration. That's the type of skills that hiring managers, engineering leads are looking for when they start to build out their teams. Keep an eye on that as you approach this program. And the final myth is like this, like, well, I've heard that like front end is harder, or I've heard like back end is harder. Well, they're both hard. So that's good. You know, they're both going to be hard. I don't think one is harder than another. I think they have different quirks and different nuances. But one thing that you have to look forward to as well is that in this program, you are going to get exposure to both front end and back end, regardless of which program you signed up for. So you'll have some exposure to both, but don't get caught up in one is harder than the other. They're both hard, but hey, that's why they pay us the big bucks, right? So that's what we're going to be getting after as we get through Turing. Are there any questions or thoughts on anything I've just said or talked about, or does anyone want me to like elaborate on any of these purported myths? All right. Okay. So another thing that we're going to do here at Turing is called the Pomodoro technique. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of this. If you haven't, no big deal. Cool. If you have, cool. That's great. So often at Turing, you're going to hear like people might be talking about like, hey, let's take a POM or let's take a POM break. This relates to like the Pomodoro technique, which is essentially a time management system for taking short breaks after bursts of focused work. So after about every 25 minutes-ish, we're going to do our best. We're going to try and take like a 5-minute break so that we can like reset, recharge, and be ready to tackle the next kind of chunk of work. So we're going to do that now. So during your POM break, I want everyone to pay attention because you need to follow these instructions. Turn your camera off and step away from the computer. I swear, seriously, get away from the computer. We're going to be on here all night. So, like I said, step away from the computer. So we're going to come back in 5 minutes. It's 6:43. So let's come back at 6:48. See you in a little bit. Hopefully we're coming back from our nice, relaxing, rejuvenating, refreshing Pomodoro break. Ready to rock. All right, cool. So we've been kind of going over some of the, setup and whatnot, but let's dive into some content here. So let's talk about the stack. What the heck is it? Well, back end, front end, full stack. What does it mean? Where does our code run? What are we even doing here? Well, let me simplify it for you a little bit here. At Turing, we teach web development. And that this means that essentially that we are building applications that live on the internet. One other quick note, I'm going to be all these slides are based on the content that we have on the lesson plan that I linked into the Slack, and it's always available to you at mod0.turing.io. I'm also going to post these slides after this lesson is over, but I do recommend taking notes, handwritten notes in your notebook as we go. So we're going to kind of talk about front end versus back end and what that means. So if you're in the front end program, you're writing code that lives on a user's computer. And when we talk about web apps, all we really need to know for that is that the code will live within the user's web browser. So that's like Chrome or Firefox or Netscape if you're getting real spicy with it. But when we think about front-end development, front end is essentially user-facing. And when you think of front end, I want you to be thinking of the presentation layer. Another thing that's important to know about front-end development is that it's very user-driven. And a lot of the concepts that we talk about with front-end development are things like data visualization and how we manage user interactions. So as front-end developers, you're going to be working with a lot of data, and then you're also going to be responsible for figuring out how to manage user interaction. So if I'm a user, when I click here, what happens? When I fill in this form this way, what happens? Okay. Questions on front-end development, like again, this is super high level. I don't expect you to be pros at this, but any questions on anything I just touched on so far? All right. Okay, if you're in the back-end program, you're going to be writing code that, unlike front-end where it's living on the user's browser, you're going to be writing code that lives on a server somewhere else. And oftentimes the code that you write is actually not going to interact directly with that same front-end user, or the user who's on their like browser just online. You're actually not going to be interacting with them directly most often. Essentially, the job of the backend is to store and manipulate data that is eventually sent to or consumed by the presentation layer or the front end. So when we talk about full stack development, like that's where you are kind of working on both sides of the house, and you are kind of writing code for the user interactions on the front end as well as the code for the back end. And again, what I mentioned earlier is that in Mod 4, as you're finishing our program out, you're going to have experience working with the front end. You're going to be working in back end, you're going to be working in front end to give you some of that full stack exposure. Another thing about back end is that backend may search through data and typically present it to the front end. Cool. So we got a front end, we got a back end. How the heck are they going to start talking to each other? Well, front end and back end technologies communicate via a protocol called HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What does HTTP stand for? Rachel H. What does HTTP stand for?
It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
Awesome. Now, what the hell does that even mean? I don't even know what that means right now. That's okay. Basically, all you need to know is that for Mod 0, all we need to know about HTTP is that this is the standard for how data is sent back and forth over the internet. When you hear HTTP, I want you to think of this is how data is sent back and forth over the internet. And I'll say that again. When you hear HTTP, I want you to think about how is data being sent back and forth over the internet. All right, Ellie, when you think of, what do I want you to think of when you hear HTTP in Mod 0?
How data is sent back and forth over the internet.
I had a hard time hearing you, but I saw that you unmuted, so maybe it's just my end, but I'm going to trust that you got it right. And in case you didn't, John S., when you think of HTTP, what do I want you to think of?
This is how data is sent back and forth over the internet.
Boom. When we hear HTTP, we just think, all right, this is how data gets sent back and forth over the internet. You're going to get a lot more detail into how that process actually happens when you start the program. But for Mod 0, all we need to know is HTTP. That's how our front end and our back end are going to communicate by sending sending data back and forth over the internet. So let's take some time in small groups. We are actually going to be working in our breakout groups again. Mason, Margot, feel free to shuffle it up to y'all if you want to do that. But we're actually going to be working together to kind of see how the stack works in action. So what I want you and your group to do is I want you to visit airbnb.com. I want you to be taking notes and talking about what you think is happening. Like when we fill out the form with our location and dates, what is happening on the front end and what is happening on the back end. When we submit the form, what is happening on the front end? What is happening on the back end? I want you to kind of go through the user flow as if you are a user on Airbnb and taking some time to figure out what's happening on the front end and what's happening on the back end. Again, I recommend like having your notebook handy so you can kind of remind yourself the differences between the front end and back end to help you get a sense of like how these different things work, okay? The person who is born in the northernmost city will kind of be like the recorder for the group and just kind of jotting down like, this is what we think is happening on the front end. This is what we think is happening on the back end. Are there any questions on what I'm asking you to do right now, or would anyone like me to explain it in a different way? Okay. All right. Again, questions are good, and I talk fast and go down rabbit holes. So, you know, if you do have questions about anything, just feel free to interrupt me or ask me to explain things. I'm always happy to do that. Okay. I guess let's spend about like, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes in these breakout rooms, and then we'll kind of come back and do some share outs about like what we thought and what we figured out, and we'll kind of have a discussion there. Sound good? All righty, give them hell, gang. Kind of think about like what you and your group walked through and what you noticed as you kind of worked through this. Okay, Andrew V. As I'm kind of like, what did you notice as you were like starting to fill in the form? Like what sort of things did you think were happening on the front end versus back end?
So us as a group, we've decided that whenever you go into location, that's immediately going to be back end because it curates based on your IP address, current locations nearby you, versus check in and check out and guest are going to be front end because they're usually static to the web page. And then they will save into your cache.
Okay, cool. So I've heard front end, I heard back end, I heard a term called cache. Cool. All right. Good thoughts. Good thoughts. Okay. George H, what did you and your group talk about as you worked through this, as you kind of played around with this site? What did you think was happening on front end versus back end?
So yeah, I was actually in the same group as Andrew.
Oh, 2 for 2 with that.
Yeah, but I mean, I can explain again. I'll pretty much just echo him. And then I guess to add to that, when you hit search, that also calls a method in the back end, and that'll generate you the list of whatever it is, and then bring you to like the next page. But yeah, all those like fancy bubbles, that's still probably front end. It's probably like React or something. Could be something else, but that's what I would guess because that's what's hot.
Cool. Awesome. All right, I may butcher this name, and I'm sorry. Marceline B?
Yeah, Marceline.
Marceline, apologies. Marceline, what did you and your group talk about?
Yeah, we had mentioned we weren't actually sure exactly what part the ISP poll for the nearby locations were, but then the front end we had for the actually like picking a location, check out dates and out, then pulling back from a back end like database sort of thing, to pull up results for it.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, like I think like a good way to think about things too is like anytime you as a human being are like doing something on a website, you're interacting with the front end, right? Like you are the user in this case. So like notice, right? Like as I click through these different parts of the site or this form, I'm getting presented with different presentation layers, right? In this, I have a chance to like, I can type in something or I can click from one of these options, right? See how as I hover over these things, like those are highlighting, that's like part of the presentation layer, right? So let's say, go down to Crested Butte, we'll go for Valentine's Day weekend. Me and my partner, Okay. Now notice too, right? Like as I click these things, we're seeing this data getting populated in this form. Okay. So right now, a lot of what is happening so far is really just happening on the front end, right? What we do know is that we have a location, we have a check-in and check-out date, and we have a number of guests. When I click this search button, that's kind of where the magic happens, right? That's where the HTTP comes into play. Peter M, thinking back to HTTP, like what is like the basic definition of that? Like, what do I want you to think of when you think of HTTP?
You want us to think of hypertext transfer protocol.
That is what it means, right? And what does that like mean to like a person who's not going through a computer programming class?
That it's how data is sent back and forth over the internet.
Totally, right? That's what I want you to remember. How do we send data back and forth? So when I hit search, that's where like the HTTP protocol really comes into place. Now I get a whole nother presentation layer, right? I'm seeing all of these different options. I get a map, like all this stuff is happening, right? But what's really happening from that first presentation layer to the second is we bundled up all of that data that we needed, the location, the check-in date, checkout date, the number of guests, and we packaged that up and sent it to our backend. Our backend checked its database and was trying to determine, okay, which results or what data do I send back to the front end that matches those requirements? That data came back, and now the front end is presenting that data in a way that a user can understand and work with, okay? So again, as you start to work, just using everyday websites or applications, I think it's always a good idea as you're kind of getting started working in computer programming, like thinking about like, this is what I think is happening on the front end, and this is what I think is happening on the back end. It's going to really help to demystify like front end versus back end, full stack, like they all rely on each other, okay? Awesome work there. So at Turing, when we talk about like front end languages and technologies, the kind of like big three that we're going to focus on are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Does anyone know any like other front end technologies that are taught at Turing or that you've heard of? Feel free to just unmute and shout things out. And it's okay if you don't know either.
Ruby.
Okay, Ruby I heard. What are some other things?
jQuery.
jQuery.
React.
React.
And Python.
Python, cool. Okay, cool. So I'd say let's keep those in mind. I think React and jQuery, definitely more front-end focused frameworks and technologies. When we talk about back-end languages and technologies, ones that you'll see often are Ruby, PHP, and Java. I also heard Python, which I think falls kind of more in the back-end camp for languages as well. Does anyone know any other back-end technologies that we kind of touch on at Turing or that you've heard of?
Postgres and Rails.
Postgres, Rails, right? Awesome.
And C++?
I think that's a back-end. Any others? Okay, now, if you were sitting there and you were like, oh shit, like I don't know any of these technologies, like I don't know those. That's okay. That's the whole point. That's why you're here. Okay. So again, like don't be stressed if some people like maybe have a little bit more like exposure or experience than you. Trust me, like that playing field gets evened after about like 1 week in our program. So don't stress on that. Totally chill if you don't know any of these things. But I mean, we've already learned so much, including HTTP. When you think of HTTP, Ashley O, what do I want you to think about?
How data gets sent back and forth across the internet.
Boom. That's how data gets sent back and forth across the internet. Cool. So in Mod 0, we're going to focus primarily on JavaScript on the front end and Ruby on the back end. The beautiful thing about these languages is that they're really similar. They use a lot of the same syntax or very similar syntax. So we're going to kind of get you exposed to these for front end and back end respectively. But feel okay knowing that you're going to oftentimes be working in mixed groups of front end, back end, and that's okay if you don't have like the syntax perfectly down. We're going to kind of work on those. And the beauty of JavaScript and Ruby is that they're actually really similar in the syntax or how we write these languages. All right, I'm gonna stop chirping at you here. Let's take another quick palm at 7:13. Let's be back at, what is that, 7:18? Cool. Come back at 7:18. We're back. Hopefully that was a good break for y'all. Ready to rock? Let's keep going. Just a quick thing too, like definitely recommend taking palms as you're working through like your pre-work and your homework and whatnot. Like a good extension you can add to Google Chrome is called Pomodoro Assistant. I think it's called Marinara. Something to take a look at if you're interested. Okay. So one thing about being a great developer is that the answers are typically out there for you. But part of being a good developer is trying to get a sense and understanding of how to actually like find the answers. And this is where Google and other search engines can really be helpful, useful tools and a huge part of your toolkit. So all developers, like literally all of them, rely on Google or other search engines like Ask Jeeves or something to find the information that they need. And one of the major differences between an experienced developer and a newer developer is that experienced developers are actually like better and more nuanced with using tools like Google to find the answers that they're looking for than a newer developer. So just to give you all like a frame of reference, like this is a quick Google search I did for myself when I was working on like adjusting parts of our website. Again, like what you'll notice is that like I'm Googling all the time. And even like the quote unquote quote easy stuff, like I'm gonna usually rely on Google so that I'm not like trying to just like memorize and remember everything, right? Part of it is getting like practice and stamina with like knowing how to do these things, but a lot of it is really just trying to figure out like this is what I'm being like really clear about what you're trying to do and finding the information that'll help you do that. Okay, so when I Google programming questions, I usually include 3 things in usually some kind of varying order. So the first thing I try to include is what I want to do. And this is, think of this almost like the verb. Like this is like the verb or what the action you are trying to do. I also will include like to what thing or noun I am trying to do that action to. And oftentimes I'll also include whatever language or framework or tool I'm using. So for example, let's say I'm on my web page, I have a heading, and I'm trying to add like a beautiful, eye-catching, thick green border. And I'm using just plain old CSS to style it. And again, if you're like listening to the sentence and you're like, I only understand like a few of the words he's talking about, like that's totally okay. We're going to get really good at using Google to help us like get the questions, or excuse me, the answers to our questions, even when we're not quite sure with everything. So if that's what I'm trying to do, add a thick green border to a heading on my web page using CSS, I might Google something like this: how to add border to heading CSS. I could also say make border on heading element CSS. What I'll often try to do as a good developer is I might try a few different search queries. A search query is just a fancy pants way of saying like, this is what I'm literally typing into Google. So how to add border to heading CSS is a search query. Make border on heading element CSS is also a different search query. I might experiment with different search queries and see if I'm getting different results. And I'm going to have to kind of work through and look at those results to actually understand if, and like, am I getting closer to the information that I need? Am I getting closer to an answer or solution to this small problem I'm trying to face? Okay. Are there any questions on kind of like this recipe or algorithm for building a search query to help you find what you need? Okay. Again, like if you have questions, like as they come up, like feel free to just like interrupt me or shout them out. You can also raise your hand in the Zoom like participants channel, or you can post them in our Slack thread too. Okay, so couple of keynotes. Googling is an art and not a science. It's something you're going to probably feel, it might feel like a little prickly and hard as you're getting started, but as you kind of get more and more experience with it, you're going to start to perfect your kind of internet sleuthing. So again, kind of what I mentioned is that you may not get the results you're looking for in your first attempt or your first go around. That's why it's important to try different search queries as you're like going through this. Cool. Now, one other thing I want y'all to be aware of is ye dreaded Google rabbit hole. So oftentimes what happens is you'll be searching for one thing and you notice an article that's like, oh, this is kind of what I'm thinking about, but this is also really interesting. And then you click on that article and that gets you searching for something else. And then you're searching for something else. And then all of a sudden you forgot what the hell you're even trying to look for in the first place. So try and keep an eye on making sure like you're keeping your eye on the prize as to like what you are trying to find or research. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of practice with this. So what I'm going to do is in our Slack, I'm going to post a scenario for you. And what I want you to do is you're going to do this in 2 steps. Step 1 is in your human notebook, not your computer. I want you to take some time to think about what are 2 search queries I would use or type in Google or Ask Jeeves or whatever the hell to help me find the information I'm looking for. And after you've had a chance to write those in your notebook, then I want you to type it in a thread to each specific scenario. Kendall H, can you kind of like synthesize like the directions on what we're going to be doing right now? I think you may be muted.
Looking at the scenario that you posted in Slack, we're going to first write in our notebook 2 different ways that we would Google a solution and then post it in the thread in Slack.
Perfect. Cool. I'll give you all about 3 minutes to do that. So scenario 1 coming in first, and then scenario 2 will be here in a second. So jot them down in your notebook first. And then I want you to type like each one of those in the thread. And it's totally okay if some of these scenarios, like the vocab or what it's asking, you're like, I don't really know what this is. That's kind of the point. We're starting to see some responses coming through.
Forever in my mind, oh
pieces in my life go away with you. About another 40 seconds or so. Again, make sure you have it in your notebook first so you can kind of come back to that. It's always good to have your notebook there for your notes. Forever in my mind, the pieces in my life go away with you. Hey Steven, I think you may have meant to post your what you would Google in. I think you posted it in the wrong thread. I forgot you were trying to do it under scenario. Just a couple, a little bit down.
There's like music playing. There's like music playing in the background, and I can't hear you really.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. Yeah, I was like, I think you meant to post that in the scenario 1 part rather than the question thread, but I like where your head's at. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through some of these. Ellie wrote how to fix commit message on Git. Awesome. Jermaine wrote git commit message edit. Love it. What else we got? Andrew wrote, how can I edit a typo in Git for version control? Cool. Jacob wrote, how to fix typo in Git commit message. Great. I think these are all really good. Sweet. I'm going to go through the next one. Robert had a really good one. He just literally wrote unterminated string meets end of file error message Ruby. Nedia, am I saying that right? Nedia?
Natia.
Natia, sorry. Natia literally just took the actual error message, unterminated string meets end of Ruby file, and Googled it. Excellent work. One thing I want y'all to be like, get in your minds right now is that error messages are the greatest thing that have ever happened to you because it gives you clues about what might be going wrong and where to start looking. So oftentimes, if you have the actual like error message, start there. That's usually a good place to start anytime you're starting to get into programming. There's a lot of really good responses in here. Great work, everyone. Okay, so we did some of that. Great. So now here comes like the next part, right? Like creating our search query is one thing, but like sifting through the results can be a little bit harder. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how I would do this for like if I wanted to find out the length of a string in JavaScript. And again, if half of those words don't make any sense to you, that's totally okay. So I'm gonna kind of model how I would do that. So I'm gonna do google.com. Cool. So I'm gonna say how to find length of a string in JavaScript. Okay, cool. Can you all see my screen okay? I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so as I look through this, typically what you're gonna see is oftentimes like the top results are usually gonna be like your first place to start, obviously, right? So the first thing that comes up for me is like this W3 schools. So I'll click that. Now, one thing about W3 schools, and I think this applies more to our front end folks out here, W3 schools is like kind of janky and doesn't always have the most like up-to-date or correct information. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's typically just like, it should not be your source of truth. I would always make sure that you're referencing other things besides W3 schools. So looks like here, I have an example. It says definition and usage. The length property returns the length of a string, number of characters. Okay, so length, that means number of characters. So the length of an empty string is 0. And then I've kind of got some other things here. Browser support, okay. I'm gonna go back to my results. Starting to get a sense. Now, the next one that comes up is developer.mozilla, also referred to as MDN, which is the Mozilla Developer Network. This is like, I don't know, I think it's probably my favorite source for technical documentation. MDN typically has a little bit more explanation and just is more up to date with a lot of things. So it says the length property of a string object contains the length of a string. Okay, well, that's not super helpful. In UTF-16 code units, length is a read-only data property of string instances. So looks like right here, one thing I wanted to show you too as well is that like what's cool about this, the MDN, I think W3 has this as well. It's like this is actual code that you can run. So it looks like we have this string here. Great. And then we're console logging the string and the string's length. Cool. So I guess this string is 42. Okay, cool. Something I can kind of play around in. Great. Again, this is getting a little bit dense for me right now. And again, as you're starting out, some of this technical documentation is going to take you time and stamina, or like the ability to build your stamina, which is like how well you can interact with this over an extended period of time. You're gonna get and build those kind of muscles as you work through the program. But again, this is kind of like my favorite spot for technical documentation. Oftentimes too, like another thing you'll see often is Stack Overflow, which is what we have here. So let's talk about Stack Overflow a little bit. Stack Overflow is like basically just like a forum or like message posting place, I guess, where people will ask questions and then anyone on the internet can answer those questions. But believe it or not, like Stack Overflow is actually like a pretty well used resource. So what you'll notice here is a few things. Like the first post is going to be like the actual question that is being asked. So this person said, how do you get the length of a string in jQuery? Now, again, that's not quite the question I asked, right? But if I look below, I have 10 answers. The first thing I want you to be aware of is like we have these numbers here, like 475, 201, 42, okay? Those refer to like the number of upvotes that this has gotten, okay? The other thing I want you to see is this check mark. It's only available on one of these typically. So the check mark means like the question's owner has accepted that this is the answer that helped them the most typically. Okay, so this person says like you don't need jQuery, you just use whatever the string is, dot length. They've actually linked to some helpful references, which is great. Okay. So again, like what you'll notice is like it may be a simple search that I did, but I still have to kind of consult a few different resources to really help me fully understand like what I'm trying to work with. Margot, Mason, do you have any other thoughts or ideas about like interacting with resources or things that you typically do when you're looking for things online that you don't necessarily have the answer to?
Yeah, I think check different things out, particularly early on as you're learning about all this stuff, because I think part of going through Turing is learning how you learn the best as well, or maybe remembering some of that. There's a lot of video resources out there, like if you search topics on YouTube, that's a time-consuming thing, so I don't think you should rely on that all the time. But sometimes some of those visual things and videos can help you, particularly early on if you're more of a visual learner, get some of those concepts down. And I like to pull up the occasional like Medium article that maybe a developer in a similar position as you, like somebody maybe learning to code for the first time wrote, because they may just have a voice that connects with you a little bit, that helps you learn that concept. But don't neglect going to like MDN and some of those sources of truth that Eric was going over. I think like you need to go to those a bit consistently, get your eyes on those several times before the process of it all is clicking in and you learn how to get information quickly from those. So do also check those out as you're trying to learn all this stuff.
I guess one more thing I would add is I also check the dates on when things are written as well, because things change so quickly in computer programming. So usually like something more recent is a little bit more reliable.
Yeah, definitely. And like, as you can see, like this top vote was written in 2009, which is dinosaur years ago in the programming world, as Margot was mentioning. But again, I think like this is kind of an interesting example because this is like a very basic thing in programming, this .length call. But yeah, as you start to like work with more new technologies later in your Turing career, you probably want to be making sure you're keeping an eye on those dates of when these things have been published or talked about, because things change really fast. Awesome. Okay. Got that. Cool. Any kind of questions or things that stood out as we kind of worked through that exercise? All right. Okay. Cool. Well, we know we can use Google to help us out, and we are going to move to talking about like what we refer to as classes in JavaScript and Ruby. Now, just a heads up, this is going to be like our very first introduction to classes, and this is going to be a concept that we're going to talk about over and over again in each one of your sessions through Mod 0. And working with classes is going to be a big focus of your Mod 0 technical assessment. So as we work through the classes part of our sessions, I want you making sure you're taking really solid notes in your notebook and asking questions when you get stuck. But again, a lot of this is going to be built with just trying to think about things, maybe not from such a technical or programming perspective, but kind of trying to think about classes as they relate to the real world. So again, like I mentioned, this is a topic that we're going to revisit over and over again, and it's going to be a big focus of your Mod 0 technical assessment. As I mentioned, we're not just going to talk about like the technical aspects. We're kind of going to be thinking about the terminology and the concepts in like a real life setting. It's okay if that sounds a little trippy right now. It'll make more sense in a little bit here. So let's talk about like what we mean by a class. So I want you to think of a class as a category of a thing. And again, I know this definition's still pretty out there, but that's okay. So when I kind of look around my room right now, I can kind of conceptualize or see different classes. So there's a computer class. There is, I have 3 sleeping cats right here. Each one of those that's a pet. So I have a pet class. I have what's a water bottle? I have a sports drink class. Now, kind of take a look at how I've written these. And one thing I want you to kind of keep in mind as you work through Mod 0 and as you start to begin your technical careers is one of the skills that is most important to start to build in yourself is attention to detail. Small things can have big impacts in computer programming. I'll say that again. Small things can have big impacts in computer programming. So syntax, or just how we write code, making sure that we're following rules and conventions is a great way to start to like do things right out of the gate. And also it's a great way to showcase your attention to detail and professionalism as you start to like apply for jobs. So take a look around your room. What are some classes that you see? Again, a class is just a category of a thing. I'm going to call on some folks to give me one example of a class they see around their room. All right, Dane, what is one class or category of thing you see in your room?
I have like a little Daruma here, it's called. So it's like a little souvenir class, maybe.
Okay, cool. Souvenir class. Great. Love it. Steven, what is a class that you see in your room or work environment right now?
I got a couple different lights. I got some string lights, some lamps, some overhead lights.
Awesome. Light class. Great. And he kind of mentioned, he says, this is going to be important. Steven mentioned, he said, I have a lot of different lights. Great. This is one light class. And we're going to talk about another term soon about instances, which I think Steven's like right on the cusp of. Awesome. Let's do one more. Ellie A. Ellie, what is a class you see in your room or environment?
Stationary.
Cool. A stationary class. Great. Awesome. These are great. Okay. So a class, again, is just a category of a thing. An instance of a class, this is kind of more of like what Stephen was just mentioning. Stephen, I might ask you in a minute here to kind of review the different light class instances you talked about. So an instance is simply a version of a particular class. So a version of a particular class is referred to as an instance. Okay, so for example, if I have a pizza class, deep dish, New York style, and pan are different instances of a pizza class. If I mention my pet class, Bandit the dog and Pumpernickel the cat are examples or instances of a pet class. Stephen, walk us through, like you kind of dove right into this in your example. What are so Stephen mentioned he had a light class in his room. What were the different instances you mentioned? I definitely heard two.
Oh yeah, so I got like the fairy lights going around my room, set the ambiance, and then I, I got just like little desk light or desk lamps, and then the overhead, just a quick flick on her.
Awesome. So I heard we have three instances of a light class in Stephen's room. We have like string lights, we had overhead lights, and we had like desktop light. Could be different instances or versions of that particular class. Awesome. So this is where we're going to talk about that kind of like attention to detail and making sure that we are following the norms and conventions for writing proper syntax. Again, syntax just means like this is like how we write code. So class names are always written in what's referred to as Pascal case. So what that means is that you're going to capitalize the first letter and capitalize any subsequent compound words. So notice that Pascal is like my first word that starts with a capital letter. Case is like my second word, starts with a capital letter. There's no space in between. They're kind of smushed together. Class names are also always singular. So for example, I would have a pizza class instead of pizzas. What's wrong with how I've written pizzas right now? Feel free to just shout it out.
It's not capitalized.
Not capitalized. That's one thing. The P is not capitalized. What's another thing that's not quite correct with our syntax of my pizzas class?
It's not singular.
There's an S at the end.
Yeah, it has an S in it at the end. It's not singular. Okay. Again, similarly, right? If I'm not going to have a pets class, I'm going to have a pet class. Capital P to start. Make sure it's singular. The reason we do that is because, remember, our class is like a category of a thing. My instances are different examples of that. That's kind of where we get into more like the making something that's singular into something that's plural. We actually kind of come up with instances. Natia, what's your question? I saw you raise your hand.
So is that the same for every language?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not going to say for every single language ever, but for working in JavaScript and Ruby, yeah, those are going to be the same.
And so when you're like defining a variable, let's say like a list, like list pizzas, you would capitalize list of pizzas, like LOP, or
So this is a great question. I think there's a lot to unpack there. So you kind of mentioned declaring a variable, and that's kind of related to what we're talking about, but it's not quite the same. We're going to talk about variable declaration a little bit later this lesson, and if not, it's part of your homework. But right now, the syntax we're talking about specifically is just for talking about classes. We'll cover some more specific variable syntax when we get to that point, but for right now, we're just laser focused on classes. It's not quite the same as declaring a variable. We'll get into that as we work through Mod 0, but I love where your head's at.
So like a category you make up though is not the same as a class. Like a class is not something that you just define, right?
Well, no, a class is something that we're going to kind of come up with and define. And we're actually going to do some practice with that in a second here. But in Mod Zero, like we're starting to build the foundations of like, again, I want you thinking about like attention to detail and like going over everything with a fine tooth comb. As we work through Mod Zero, part of it, like we're going to be working like really like in the correct syntax and like talking about things exactly how they're written. As we start to think about like classes and instances, we're going to be kind of using like pseudo syntax in Mod Zero, which is helping us to just kind of think about these things in like a little bit bigger picture, not so focused on the granularity of the syntax for writing classes or building classes. It's more going to be focused on like thinking about these things in a bigger, almost real world scenario. So as you work through your homework and the Mod 1 pre-work, those are going to be your opportunities to practice writing proper syntax for the different exercises that you're going to be working through, okay? But in class, like, especially as we start to introduce and cover some of the stuff about classes, some of that's gonna be not as syntax heavy. Okay, one more example before we do a little practice on our own is golf course. Again, it's singular, and since it's a compound word, I'm gonna capitalize both parts of that word, kind of smush them together. Okay, let's do a little practice. I want you to, and I said in Slack, but we're going to kind of do that same cadence that we did the other one, where I'm going to have you actually write it down in your notebook first and then write it in Slack. I'll post the thread in a second. But I want you to write 2 sentences that follow this structure. Blank, blank, and blank are instances or are different versions of a blank class. So if we kind of go back to my first example, I could say like Nigel the cat, Pumpernickel the cat, and Bandit the dog are different versions of a pet class. Deep dish, pan, and New York style are different versions of a pizza class. So in your examples, I would like you to not choose pizza or pets, but there are plenty of other classes, as we saw just looking around our room, that we could come up with. So I'll post this in our channel, in our Slack thread right now, make a new thread for y'all to use. But again, jot this down in your notebook first. Also 10-4 in the music, I'll put it way low. Again, thinking about attention to detail. As you write out like your class, think about making sure you're following our basic syntax of writing it in Pascal case and making sure our class name is singular. Andrew, I like your examples, but keep an eye on your syntax for your class name. Gunner, like where your head's at with your instances, but keep an eye on your syntax for your beer class. Cool. I'm seeing a lot of cool examples coming through. This is great. I'm seeing a lot of folks using Pascal case. I'm seeing a lot of folks use singular class names. Great. Awesome attention to detail. I can also tell that people are clearly looking around their room, which is great. I hope there aren't too many beers being cracked during class, but there are beer classes, that's fine. All right, cool. So if you kind of take a look in the thread, Rachel wrote, Sharpie, pen, pencil are different versions of a writing tool. Love it. Snapback, cowboy, and fedora instances are versions of a hat class. Great. Oil, acrylic, watercolor are different versions or instances of a paint class. Awesome. One I want to bring attention to is Peter. Peter, I think you're really close on this, Peter. Peter wrote stout, lager, ale are different instances of a beer styles class. So what we're going to see as we start to talk a little bit about attributes in a second here, is that like those could be an attribute or a style of a beer class. So the thing itself is beer, and it might have a style, which is stout, lager, ale. So keep that in mind, or maybe kind of flag that. I'll put an emoji by this one to kind of keep our eyes on as we think about how we might change this in the future. But I love where your head's at. This is a great start. Okay, cool. Any questions as you were like working through your classes, or any thoughts or questions that came up as you worked through this? Love, love, love the attention to detail on the Pascal case and singular on all these classes. Great job. All right. Okay, so this is kind of what I was talking about next, okay? So let's talk about attributes of a class quickly. So an attribute of a class is a characteristic that every instance of that class has. For example, if I'm thinking about my pizza class, again, notice I got my Pascal case, I have my singular for that. And again, we're thinking big picture here. I want you, as we kind of go through these examples, instead of like thinking about like all of the edge cases or things where maybe this isn't true, try and think a little bit higher level about like, we can agree for the most part that all instances of these classes have potentially these attributes. So each instance of a pizza class has a crust, sauce, and toppings attributes. Each instance of a pet class has a color, species, size, number of legs, temperament, and age. Each instance of a book class has a title, author, publisher, published date, and total pages attributes. See a lot of people jotting notes down as we go. That's awesome. It's a great way to help you start to conceptualize and internalize these concepts. If you're one of those students who maybe struggles sometimes to keep up with like jotting notes down, that's totally okay. Again, I'm going to post these slides after this lesson, and all of these slides are essentially based on the lesson plan I sent earlier. Robbie D, what you got?
I'm assuming attributes don't have Pascal casing and you do an underscore instead of no spacing whatsoever between them.
Yeah, I love that you're already starting to kind of pick up on some differences that we're noticing in our attribute names, right? Yeah, so our attribute names, and again, we're kind of using like pseudo syntax here, but yeah, they're not going to follow Pascal case. They're going to be lowercase usually, and typically in Ruby, you will see like number underscore of underscore legs for my pet example, like you'll separate those words with underscore. In JavaScript, you'll often see those as camel case, which would look like lowercase n and then an uppercase O and an uppercase L. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but yeah, I think the important thing to recognize is like, this is a little bit different than our Pascal case. That's awesome. Cool. Okay, so get my handy dandy examples up. All right, we're gonna do that same exact thing, okay? Where I'm gonna have you in your notebook first, jot down 2 sentences that follow this same structure. So each instance of a blank class has, and then at least 3 different attributes. Take your time to jot those down in your notebook first, and I'm going to post a new thread in our Slack. Starting to see some examples come through. Take your time. Aiden, I like where your head's at. Keep an eye on your attention to detail for how you wrote your snack class. Steven, same with you in terms of your class as well. Make sure it's following Pascal case. Feel free to edit. Cool, cool, cool. I can tell most people didn't eat before because I'm getting a lot of food. That typically happens. That's all good. All right. Dane wrote, each instance of an album class has a length, title, and number of tracks attributes. Awesome. Zach wrote, each instance of a printer has a paper feeder, ink, and paper type. Great. Cool. Awesome. These are great. These are awesome. Okay. So I want to quickly go back to the first example when we had Peter. I'm going to kind of call on you here. So when I asked for the first example where it said blank, blank, and blank are instances or different versions of a class, Peter, I saw that you wrote stout, lager, ale are different instances of a beer styles class. How could we maybe change or adjust like that? Instead of calling it beer styles, how could we maybe adjust that? And what would stout, lager, and ale be?
Yeah, so
it's okay if you don't know.
I was probably too specific with the class because then it limited us to only styles, and styles probably should have been one of the attributes within it. So
awesome.
Beer would be the class, style would be the attribute, and then within that we would have 3 different instances that I've listed there.
Perfect. Hell yeah. Awesome. Right. So again, I think Peter brought up another good thing. He said, when I wrote beer styles, I kind of like boxed myself in. I couldn't really give it more attributes if I needed. By having a style called, or a class just called beer, I could have an attribute that's like style. I saw some other examples for beer. We could have like volume or ABV or all those type of things, taste, all those kind of things. These are great examples. Awesome. So there's a lot of awesome examples y'all came up with, and I saw a lot of great attention to detail too, as well, with how you were capitalizing your classes, but keeping your attributes lowercase, and for compound words using either the underscore or the camel case. Great work. Cool. All right. Sweet. Any questions on like those differences between attributes and classes and instances?
So I guess, so an instance, or all instances of the same class are going to have these attributes, but I guess the value of that attribute is not always going to be the same, correct?
John,
Like,
say that again. That was perfect. Say that one more time.
so I guess the different instances of the same class, they may all have the same attributes, but those values will be different or can be different.
That right there is going to help all of y'all understand classes and instances and attributes better. That is what we're going to be evaluating you on as we work through Mod 0. Your understanding of this idea that all instances are versions of a class, and all of those instances are going to have the same attributes. However, the value of those attributes could be different between each one of those, right? So like think about like an example of like a book, right? Every book class is going to have a title, an author, and let's just go with total pages, right? But as I scan my bookshelf, right, like all of those books have different authors. They all have different titles, and they all have a different number of pages. But we can all agree that they're all still part of the book class, right? And they all still have those same attributes that we're looking for. But as John mentioned, the value of those attributes is different. That's exactly what we're going for. Great work. And again, if that's like making a little bit of sense right now, that's okay. I don't expect y'all to be masters of that just yet. Any other questions or thoughts before we move on? All right. Cool. All right, sweet. So we're gonna probably have time to cover a good portion of the data types in today's lesson. We probably won't have time today to talk about variable assignment, but there are some great resources at the end of the lesson that I'll highlight before we kind of close out. But let's talk about some basic data types right now. So what's really beautiful about programming is that, yeah, there are a lot of different languages, and yeah, they all have their different like nuances, but for the most part, most programming languages actually use the same basic data types. And when I say a data type represents the kind of data that you can use in a given programming language. Kind of what I mentioned earlier, right, is that what's kind of fortunate for us as we start to our programming journey is that the syntax, or the way that we write these basic data types, is almost identical in Ruby and JavaScript. So as we start to explore these different data types right now, we're going to kind of be like imagining that we are building an application that maybe a grocery store would use. And that's how we're going to kind of frame as we think about our different data types. This will make a little more sense in a second. So let's talk about our first data type, which is strings. So a string is a data type that's used to represent text. So anytime we are working with or manipulating text, you're going to be working with strings. So strings can contain alphabet characters, but in addition to like spaces between our characters, numbers, special characters, emojis. So some examples of a string are, this is a string. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. This is a string. phone number of Turing, I think. Turing School of Software and Design. Wow, what a beautiful string. What are some, take a look at these strings. What is something that you notice about these strings? And when you think you notice the one similarity between these strings, I want you to take your human finger and put it on your nose. When you see what's maybe similar about all of these strings, put your finger on your nose. See, Jacob's got his finger on his nose. Steven's got his finger on his nose. All right, Ryan S., what do you notice is the same between all these strings?
I noticed that they have double quotes around them.
Yeah, they're all wrapped in quotation marks. Awesome. That's what I was hoping that y'all would notice, right? And I noticed too that you mentioned that they're wrapped in double quotation marks. So oftentimes you'll see them in double, sometimes you'll see them in single. And I think as you're learning to program too, sometimes students are like, well, which one is it? Single or double? Like, which one should I use? Well, the answer is you can use either. But what we want to see is that you're being consistent. So if you're using double quotes, use that all the way through. If you want to use single quotes, you're doing that the whole way through. It's really tough sometimes when I'm looking at a larger blocks of code and I'm noticing like strings are being used with double quotes or single quotes and it's like alternating. Like one of the things that you'll start to get good at as you start to learn programming, like one thing that in addition to attention to detail is be consistent. If you're doing those two things right out the gate, you're already separating yourself from other people who are learning these skills. Great work. Okay, in your notebook, I want you to jot down like a couple examples of data that we would use for our grocery app that would utilize strings. So what is some data that we would use if we were building a grocery app that would use strings as their data? I'll probably just call on some folks randomly. Again, no worries if you're not sure that we're learning, all good. All right. Okay, I'm just going to start calling on a few folks. Again, just jot down a couple. No need to go nuts. All right, Beth, what's one example of data that we would use in a grocery app that would maybe use strings?
Potentially good greeting by time of day, like breakfast
Love
versus
that.
lunch.
Greeting by time of day. Awesome. So good morning, good afternoon, good night. Awesome. Love that. Darla, what's another thing that might use a string?
The phone number of the grocery store.
Yeah, could use the phone number. Erica, what's another place we could use a string if we were building a grocery app? I think you might be muted.
Hello, store address, sorry.
Store address, perfect. Those are all great examples, right? Like store name, product names, like all things around like names or text, those are using strings. Great work. All right, let's talk about integers and floats. So an integer is a whole number, AKA not a fraction, that can be positive, negative, or zero. And just again, quick kind of note there is that integers cannot have decimal places because they're whole numbers. So an example, get ready for some groundbreaking examples of integers. 21, it's an integer. Wow, beautiful. Negative 350, it's an integer too. Unbelievable. 0, whole number, integer, believe it or not. Wow, groundbreaking stuff. So we got integers and floats. Now, for all my front end mafia, the good news is in our neck of the woods, like all numbers are basically integers. For my back end folks in Rubius, like there is a little bit more nuance between integers and floats, but I believe in you. I think you'll get the difference pretty quick. A float is also known as a floating point number, which is just a fancy pants way of saying it's a number that contains a decimal point. That's all that is. Just like integers, right? A float can also be positive or negative. So here's some more wonderful floats for everyone. Negative 55.2. Wow. 21.44. Whoa. 0.01. They're all floats. Unbelievable. Okay, in your notebook, write down what are some examples of like data in our grocery app that might utilize floats or integers. Alrighty. Okay, Andrew, what is one example of data we could use in our grocery app that might require us using integers or floats?
Expiration date.
Expiration date. Okay, cool. I would say, I think your head's in the right spot, but I think that if we think about that, I actually think that a different data type might be better for that. What could a different data type that we've already talked about potentially we use instead for an expiration date?
Strings.
Yeah, I think a string, because an expiration date usually has like numbers and either words like September 3 or like 9/10, right? Integers and floats are just going to be numbers. So I think you're close, but your example, I think, highlights that sometimes we're going to use strings to be a little bit more all-encompassing, because we can have numbers and letters and symbols in that. Can you think of another example that might use integers or floats?
Prices without the $sign.
Perfect. A price would be a great example. Awesome. Riley, what's another data that we could use integers for?
Oh, sorry, credit card information.
Yeah, maybe like a credit card number. Great. Awesome. Okay, cool. Just to 5, how well we're feeling about strings and floats. So 5 means like, yeah, I feel really good about these. 0 means like, I don't understand these at all. And you can put any number in between. If you're at like a 3, I'm good with that. So show me on your actual human hand how well you're feeling about strings and floats. Cool. Again, if you're at like a 3, that's good with me. Okay. Let's talk about Booleans. This is where things get this is my favorite data type in terms of name. So it's almost, Booleans are tricky because as you're learning it, because it's like literally so simple that it's sometimes confusing. And I know that sounds weird, but trust me. So a Boolean value is either true or false. Those are the only values you can have for a Boolean value. So this is kind of where this gets a little bit more nuanced, is that Boolean values are used in Boolean logic. Boolean. Okay, whatever. All that means is a subset of algebra used for creating true false statements. Now, I'm sure some of you are shaking in your boots like, wait, there's going to be math involved? No. Don't worry about all the algebra stuff. It's not a big deal. Really, we'll use Booleans to determine like, is something true or false? And we'll get more into that later in this month. So an example of a Boolean value is true or false. So feel free to jot this down here. We cover it in the lesson a bit, but we're not going to focus on this in this lesson. But these are different operators that will help with Boolean logic. This is giving you anxiety. Don't worry about it right now. We're going to cover this in a lot more detail later on. So y'all know the drill. What could be an example of data in our grocery app that would use like true or false This is tricky. All right. Andrew V, what you got for me? What's something we'd write in our app, our grocery app, that might use a Boolean value?
If it's available or not.
Yeah, perfect. Is something available? Is available, true or false? Awesome, that's great. Maria D, did you come up with anything different for like a Boolean value we could use in our grocery app?
I did. I don't know if this is right, but like login information or credit card information, if it's not correct, it won't let you log in.
Okay, I like where your head's at, because we're going to be like, that is like essentially where that logic might be taking place, right? Like, are we checking to see that your credit card information is correct? So we could have like correct credit card, true or false, right? If it's true, we move on with the checkout. If not, we give them a message. I'm going to move on because we could spend all day talking about Boolean logic, and we will as you go through the program. We're going to move on. Okay. This is like an array is our first complex data type. So an array is a data structure that represents a group of things. So I want you to think of an array as like a collection or a box or a container. So instead of saying like, I have a collection of shirts, you could say, I have an array of shirts. Instead of saying, I have a box of kittens, I have an array of kittens. Okay. Now, like one thing that's like kind of important to think about, like with arrays too, is that like, since we're talking about collections, we're talking about more than one thing, right? So another kind of nuance to arrays is that the elements or things in an array are all of the same data type typically. So I might have an array that contains only numbers, or I might have an array that contains only strings. So again, if I had like an array of values, that might contain a bunch of different integers. If I have an array of kittens, that might contain a bunch of strings that have like the kittens' names inside of it. So arrays are very common in computer programming because it allows us to organize data so that related sets of values can be easily sorted or searched. We're not going to get into the syntax of how to write arrays today. We're really just going to focus more on like the concept. So again, this is what this is an example of syntax, but this is some syntax of what an array of integers might be. Notice I have like these square brackets. Think of that as like my box, right? It literally almost looks like a box. That's like containing my collection. So all of those, like this is one array that has many values. Similarly, this is one array with a collection of strings inside. Questions on arrays before we start like playing with them a little bit and thinking about our grocery app? Robbie, what's up?
Is the distinction between an array and like attributes in how you display them or what you use them for, or like
Yeah,
it seems like.
So I think that you're I think that you're getting a little bogged down potentially in like the distinction between like the syntax and the concept, which is normal for this first session. For right now, at like I want us to like get like a higher level, like in like a higher view of this. So for this part, we're not as focused always on the syntax, but I want you thinking for right now, like I want you walking out of this class knowing when I hear the word array, I'm thinking of a collection of things that are related. An array is a collection of things that are related. You'll see as we start to like work with the syntax of building classes, like I might give an attribute a value of an array, but again, that's kind of farther down the road. We don't have to get too bogged down in that right now, but that's an excellent question though. Cool. In your notebook, I want you to jot down where will we maybe use an array in our shopping list? And a hint I'm going to give you is I want you to start all of your answers with a list of blank. All right. Okay, now that was quick. Where could we maybe have a list of things in our app? Jermaine, what's something you came up with for where would we maybe use an array in our grocery app?
Maybe to divide up different foods. So I put juice.
Okay, so like a list of juices, right? So we'd have like, and maybe in our array, we'd have like orange, apple, grape juice, other fruit juices. Good, awesome. Tyler, what's another example of an array we might have in our grocery app?
Like a list of sale items.
Awesome, love it. List of items on sale. So probably like prunes or old cereal. I don't know. Awesome. Kendall, take us home. What's another example where we might have an array?
A list of store departments.
Perfect. Store departments. Great. Deli, cosmetics, snacks. Awesome. This is great. Cool. All right, sweet. So I want to bring our attention to go to our mod 0. Again, I recommend bookmarking our mod0.turing.io. This is kind of like your source of truth for all of the wonderful things we're going to be doing in mod 0. So if you navigate to this sessions part, that's where we're going to have all the essentially the lesson content that we're going to cover. And again, as I mentioned, right, like this is like our lesson plan that I essentially built our slides off of. And this is a great place to like preview lessons, review lessons, or go back to the parts of the things that we covered that were maybe a little confusing or you need to review again. That's going to be an important skill to start developing now before you start the program, is that ability to kind of go back into lesson plans and identify those areas where you're feeling a little shaky and practicing those parts again. So we completed all of this part right here. And we didn't quite have time for this syntax practice about variable assignment and assigning a variable. That's totally okay. There's going to be times where we don't necessarily get through everything in the lesson, and that's not a big deal. What's great about this part here is that we have some examples for you to practice in JavaScript if you're front end or Ruby in your back end. And we actually have some videos for you to practice as well that kind of walk through these things. This piece here is like an exercise we want you to do on your own. Again, we're not going to check this, but I highly recommend doing this on your own. This section here will probably take you about 15 minutes, I would imagine, 15, 20 minutes, but it's going to be super helpful for you. I would maybe probably do this before you dive into your homework this week, okay? You'll also notice that we have like these answer keys, right? I'd say generally, like we don't usually provide answer keys. Like one thing I want you to make sure you understand now is that getting the like correct answer like isn't necessarily always the goal. Especially in mod 0, we want you really focusing on exploring and practicing and focusing really a lot more on like that attention to detail and conceptualizing these topics well, okay? But this is a great place for y'all to actually practice this, okay? So, yeah, so that's like essentially our time for today. If you haven't had a chance like to explore this site, like this was kind of, it was linked in that initial email message I sent. But again, I recommend like all y'all make sure you go through your computer setup first. This is like a really step-by-step instruction. I know some of you are still waiting on your MacBooks to kind of come through, but those should be arriving any day now. In terms of your homework, you should have all actually already copied this over, but again, this Trello board, hopefully you've already worked through your Mod 0 pre-work. I could tell many of you have because you're already kicking ass using Slack and threading, which is awesome. But your homework for our first session is going to be these tasks right here. So as you click into these, there are going to be links. There are also going to be like what we actually want you to do. And you'll be kind of moving through these different exercises as we go. If we take a look, the Mod 0, if I look at the calendar here, again, this is always going to show us our calendar. You'll notice that your homework from tonight's session and your homework from tomorrow's session are actually going to be due at the beginning of our session 3 on Thursday. So you'll have a couple evenings to kind of work through those. I tried to, in those like homework examples, I tried to give y'all like a sense of like how long to kind of budget for these. So with session 1, we got like about hour 45, session 2, a little bit bigger. Okay, so make sure you're budgeting time and looking at those before you kind of, as you make your plan. All right, that's a lot of talking at you. Are there any questions about like the logistical piece of the things that I just discussed in terms of like where to find your homework or your calendar or our Mod 0 site?
On Trello, does it explain where to turn things in?
Yeah, so it'll probably say that more in, like essentially what's going to happen is as you complete these, we are going to like be checking them. So you'll have some directions in terms of how to actually, you'll get directions on what's called forking the gist. And again, if that's gibberish to you right now, that's totally okay. One key thing I want everyone to focus on right now is one thing that we're going to be focusing on as we evaluate you in Mod 0 is, again, as I mentioned, your attention to detail. So in a lot of these exercises, we're going to give you very explicit instructions on what we want you to do. If you just skim through everything, you're probably going to make some mistakes that are going to cause you more work and take more time. I highly recommend for all of your assignments and exercises, carefully reading the directions first before launching into the work that we ask you to do. That's going to be something that's going to help us to evaluate your readiness for Mod 1. How well are you growing in your attention to detail and following directions? So yeah, great question. I'm not going to give you the answer. The answer is in your assignments.
I have a question about the pre-work for Mod 1. So yeah. I got confused. And I actually thought it was due like way earlier than it actually is. Cool. So I spent like the past like week, instead of like celebrating the holidays, I was grinding. So I'm pretty much done with all of them. Should I submit them or should I just hold off and just like?
So I would recommend holding off, because one thing you'll see in as part of Mod 1 pre-work is like, I think as you start to get more exposure to the exercises you're going to do in Mod 0, there's probably going to be some things in your Mod 1 pre-work that you've already worked on that may be not as up to snuff or up to par as maybe you would like. And maybe you didn't have the same attention to detail going through those because you were cramming as you would having a little bit more time. One common thing that is part of being a great computer developer or computer programmer, excuse me, is this process of refactoring. Refactoring is essentially going back and like making your code more clear or more concise or more accurate or more syntactically correct. So what I recommend doing is like making sure you're spending a good amount of time going through the homework exercises. And then closer towards the end of our session, I would recommend going back through your Mod 1 pre-work that you've already gotten a really good head start on and like going through it with a fine-tooth comb and refactoring or making changes to any places that need some work done. Again, if y'all are like haven't started your Mod 1 pre-work, that's totally okay. But it is important to kind of take a look at the calendar and see when it's due, which is in about 3 weeks, and making a plan for how you plan to get it done, because the Mod 1 pre-work is going to take some time to work through as well. I think a good approach is to work through like these homework exercises first, and then work through some of your pre-work a couple days later. So each one of these homework assignments is going to walk you through an important concept of computer programming that's going to come back in your Mod 1 pre-work. So I might work on my homework for this session's homework tomorrow night, and then I might work on some of the pre-work this weekend. So kind of working through both a little by little.
All right, so
questions or comments?
Yeah, I got a question about the what is the pre-work? Like, what's the difference between the pre-work and the homework itself? Like the thing that says for the January 6th, it says 2102 Mod 1 pre-work due for 2011 alpha. What does that even mean?
Yep. So again, I'm going to bring us back to our main site here. So we have two things, right? You have your homework, which is kind of outlined again. In this Trello board. Myself and the other TAs and some other TAs who may not be teaching you directly are going to be providing a little bit of feedback on your homework assignments as you work through this session. Okay, again, we're going to be to be very transparent, we're going to be focusing a lot on your attention to detail and your ability to follow directions in the homework assignments. Okay, each one of those assignments, each one of these little cards is going to allow you to you'll have very clear directions on what we want you to do. Okay, there's also this Mod 1 pre-work. Okay, this is going to be you're going to have to probably work on these concurrently. Okay, so during the next few weeks, you're going to have to work on both of these things. Your Mod 1 pre-work includes some professional development assignments, something called Gear Up. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because it's all available to you on this page. I'm going to give you the time and space to synthesize this. And then this technical pre-work, okay? So I didn't catch who was saying that they'd already finished some of this, but they've probably worked on some of the technical pre-work. But again, like these have some this professional development will probably take about 2 hours. Your Gear Up will take about 2 hours. And the technical pre-work will take between 30 and 35 hours. So part of what we're going to be looking for, and we can provide coaching too in Mod 0, is like how to start managing your time to manage all of these different competing priorities, right? I think that one thing that's important to do in Turing and in any professional setting is communicate, right? If you're finding yourself struggling or falling behind, you need to reach out to your instructor or TAs immediately so we can help make a plan to get you caught up, okay? But all of this, again, is kind of on this Mod 0 site. So if you haven't had a chance, again, I know people have, and are still working jobs and this, that, and the other. So it's okay if you haven't had a chance to fully synthesize all this before this session. But now that we've started this session, I want you to make sure you take some time to go through this and have a good understanding of what you need to do and when it's due. If any questions come up with that, I would encourage you to ask in the session 1 questions thread that I posted in Slack so that everyone can see the response to that question. Okay, so especially with technical questions, if you're going back through the notes of this lesson, you're like, man, I just don't understand Booleans. If you ask that question in the session 1 questions thread that I posted in our Slack, myself, Mason, and Margot are going to be monitoring that Slack questions thread. And we'll probably be able to give you an answer to those specific questions within 24 to 48 hours. That being said, there are 30 other teachers in this room between all of y'all. So if you notice someone ask a question and you have an answer for it, answer it in the thread, because that's how you're going to get your questions answered a lot more quickly, by posting them publicly in Slack so that everyone can kind of tag team together and get it done. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot of talking. Any other questions about like the logistics piece of all this?
Yeah, I guess just a bit of a clarification on the stuff that you just said, specifically referring to kind of what Stephen was saying. It states on Wednesday, mod 1 pre-work, not a specific type of pre-work. I guess what my question is this seems to imply that all of the mod 1 pre-work is due the 6th.
Yeah, sorry. So if you click, good call, good question. Sorry. So if you click on this, like this is for 2001A section and earlier. If you look at our, sorry, I misunderstood y'all's question earlier. Sorry, Stephen. We're 2011B. So our pre-work, y'all's pre-work is going to be due in next Friday. So it's a little tighter turnaround, but not due on Wednesday.
Okay, so next Friday, all the technical work, the professional development, all that'll be due, not this Friday, but next Friday.
Yep, exactly. And we'll talk a little bit too about like, we're going to, as we get deeper into this session, we'll talk about like our expectations. Like you'll see, like we have an assessment on next Wednesday. And we'll talk about like how we go through evaluating that as well as your pre-work to determine your readiness for mod 1. Cool, great question. Sorry if that was unclear earlier. Any other questions? Okay, if you have a technical question, where's the best place to post that?
Slack.
Yeah, put that in Slack. If it's related to the content we covered in the session, put it in there. But if it's like if it's kind of like a more one-off question, like I think it's a great place to still put like any questions you have in our public Slack so that everyone can get exposed to that and see the answer or answer it themselves. Great.
Just real
Andrew, what's
quick,
your
I noticed that you're recording. Are we able to find these recordings?
Yeah, I'm gonna post it. It takes like a few hours to like compress and synthesize into workable video. I'll post it tomorrow morning.
Perfect.
I'll post that, and I'll post the slides. I'll probably post those right after our lesson, right after we end in a couple minutes. But yeah, video recordings we'll post usually the next morning.
Sorry, my internet cut out for a sec.
You're okay.
Everything's due next Friday. Is that correct?
Yeah, next Friday, the mod 1 pre-work is due.
Yeah.
Your homework assignments we have outlined on their specific due dates also on the calendar.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I saw those. I just wasn't sure about the pre-work.
Yep.
Because I guess there's a due date on Wednesday, but that's not for us.
Yeah, and again, so if you click on that, that's for 2011A. So y'all are 2011B. So there's a group that started like before like the holidays. That will be in your cohort, but they just had a different time to go through mod 0. So theirs is due sooner. Yours is due next week.
Okay. Sorry, my internet cut out. Thanks.
You're all good. No worries.
Real quick, I know we're running late. I'm on the wait list for the February cohort. Should I still try and finish that pre-work by next Friday, or?
I would say reach out to Aaron and Darren, and they'll give you a sense of like whether if that's going to open up. But similar to, I forget who asked, but like I do think it's still worth like going through and doing that pre-work as we're going through right now and trying to aim for that Friday due date, with the understanding that even if you get pushed to a cohort down the road, like you'll have like that good like baseline that you can kind of come back to and refactor before you start up again. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Cool. Alrighty, gang. If there's no other questions, feel free to drop off. And if you do have technical questions or anything that come up, put it in Slack, and myself, Margot, or Mason will try and respond within 24 to 48 hours. If there's technical things that come up and you recognize that you have an answer, help your cohort mates out and get that threaded in their questions. Alrighty, later, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.
Hey, guys.
We did it, gang.